Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people, places and history. It's designed for you to learn things about London that most Londoners don't even know. I am your host, Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide and CEO and founder of londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Each episode is supported by show notes, transcripts, photos and further reading, all to be found on our website. Click on londonguidedwalks.co.uk, podcast, and then select the episode that you fancy. And if you enjoy what we do, then you'll love our guided walks and private tours that we offer throughout the year. So get that cup of tea, put your feet up, and enjoy. The relationship between Robert Dudley and Elizabeth I is fascinating. Their alliance was characterised by an intriguing blend of personal intimacy and political alliance, a relationship that has captivated historians and enthusiasts alike. Dudley was not only a close confidant and favourite of the Queen, but also a constant presence in the political machinations of the time. Connecting the historical intrigue to the imposing presence of the Tower of London adds a compelling layer to our discussion on today's episode. The Tower, with its deep-rooted history and royal drama, imprisonment and execution, stands as a sombre reminder of the era's turbulence. It is a monument that has witnessed the zeniths and nadirs of English royalty and nobility, including the figures that we're going to be talking about today. Joining me in the studio today is Corina Apostu, who has an academic background rooted in the University of Kent, where she pursued a Master of Arts in Medieval and Early Modern Studies. Corina has dedicated a significant portion of her scholarly endeavour to understanding the intricate dynamics of court politics during the reign of Elizabeth I. Her dissertation offers a compelling explanation of the demise of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, a nobleman of considerable influence and a political figure within the Elizabethan court. For Corina, the Tower of London is not just a landmark of stone. It's a nexus of the historical tales she has unravelled, a silent witness to the secret whispers and public proclamations that shaped the Elizabethan court. And her studies have provided her with a unique lens through which to view this iconic edifice. Today we'll be talking about their connection to one of the most important and imposing landmarks in London, the Tower of London. Welcome, Corina.
Thanks so much for having me, Hazel. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's one of my favorites.
Oh, you're telling me. I mean, Elizabeth I is one of my favourites anyway, so I don't really need an excuse to talk about her, but you can't know everything, which is where you come in. But I think maybe it's worth starting off with maybe the lesser known of the two names that we're talking about, and that is Robert Dudley. So who is Robert Dudley?
Right. Well, as you say, pretty much everyone knows who Elizabeth I is. But sometimes when I mention Robert Dudley to people, I kind of get blank stares in response. So, as you say, who is this man? Robert Dudley was the fifth son of John and Jane Dudley, who were the Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, though they were only up-and-coming gentry when Robert was born in June of 1532, and he was only a year older than Elizabeth herself. As an adult, he was a courtier, politician, and magnate in Elizabeth's court, but alongside that, he was also her long-held favorite, companion, and one of her oldest and dearest friends. In fact, they were so close and openly affectionate with each other that there were constant rumors claiming that they were lovers. Robert even became one of the strongest contenders for Elizabeth's hand in marriage after his first wife, Amy, died in mysterious circumstances in 1560. They never did marry, obviously, but they remained close for the rest of their lives together. Whether they were indeed lovers or not is beyond the scope of this podcast, but what is most important to know for today is that they had been in each other's orbits since childhood. We know this because Robert later told a French ambassador in 1566 that he had known Elizabeth since she was 8 years old, and she had told him that she never wanted to marry, even at that tender age.
And how close were they in childhood? Do we know?
How close they were in childhood is impossible to determine with any certainty, but Elizabeth clearly felt comfortable enough to divulge such a personal desire to him as children, and the Dudley family had always been near to the center of the English court. Robert's father was a talented politician and soldier, and his mother once served Anne Boleyn as lady-in-waiting.
He's got to have been a handsome so-and-so as well.
Yes, funnily enough, there is actually quite a few ambassadors commented on that he was a beautiful man or a handsome man of some sort, and it truly is amusing to read, especially because half the time they also couldn't stand him as a person, but they had to admit he was pretty handsome.
I know people working in the city like that now. So he was handsome. He had obviously training from the skills from his father and the knowledge from his mother working at court, because, you know, being a favourite for so long, for someone who we often understand with Elizabeth is quite tempestuous in her friendships, pulling and pushing at the cords of friendship. He stays there with her, so he must have been able to find a particular niche that no one else could.
Yes, absolutely, and I think this kind of goes back to it is related to what we're going to speak about today, and a part of it, I think, is the longevity of the relationship, the depth of their bond, simply because for how long they've known each other, for how many things they went through, which were very similar. I think it struck a very deep bond between them, and Elizabeth knew that she could trust him, despite what everyone else was thinking. And Elizabeth really cherished the people she knew she could trust. We kind of have this idea of the Tudors being, you know, like lopping off the heads of everybody they loved. That's more Henry VIII. He's kind of the axe-happy one. Elizabeth was far more hesitant with the axe. Certainly plenty of people were executed in her reign too, but she was deeply reluctant to turn on those who were very close to her and who she was emotionally connected to and who she had tested and had seen, right, yeah, you're trustworthy. And Robert Dudley was one of them.
I suppose being monarch in any age, you're going to be limited by a very small number of people that you can trust, your inner circle, as it were.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I suppose for Elizabeth as well, you know, bypassing the life expectancy age and people popping off, and that circle getting smaller and smaller as well. And if you think of times when she feels like she really has been let down, if you think about Lettice Knowles, for example, she really does flip one because it's a personal attack to her.
Absolutely, I fully agree with that, and I think a lot of people view that whole scenario as kind of Elizabeth being monstrously jealous, and certainly she was a very possessive and jealous woman. But what people kind of fail to understand is that she had also been extremely close to the Knollys family, to Lettice's entire family, and potentially to Lettice herself. And so when it comes out that Lettice had married Robert Dudley, it must have felt like an almighty stab in the back. And obviously Elizabeth did not handle it very well, but I almost don't blame her. I feel like I understand just from an emotional point of view why she reacted that way, although certainly I think she took it a little bit too far with how long she held that grudge and how hostile she was to Lettice for the rest of their lives. But again, that's beyond the scope of this podcast. But it's interesting you mentioned that because it brings to mind Elizabeth once said something like, I have found treason in trust, which is that she has had her trust betrayed many, many times. And so those who proved to be loyal to her, she was very grateful for. And even with Robert, when he did occasionally hurt her, either politically or personally, he always seemed to be able to make it up to her, or at the very least, she was able to eventually forgive him, because he proved his mettle in other ways.
Yeah, yeah. And our particular focus today is the Tower of London and the relationship with Robert Dudley and Elizabeth I with the Tower of London specifically. So how are Robert and Elizabeth related to the Tower of London?
Well, as most people will know from their history lessons, the Tower of London was originally built by William the Conqueror and acted in the beginning as sort of a secure fortress and a symbol of royal power. So it wasn't, a prison from the get-go. With time, though, it also became a prison, and some of the most high-profile prisoners in history have been held there. Well, in English history, of course, including Elizabeth's ill-fated mother, Anne Boleyn. Robert Dudley's family, too, also lost a family member to the Tower already, Robert's grandfather Edmund, who was executed at the very start of Henry VIII's reign. Though today the tower is dwarfed by surrounding high-rise buildings, in the Tudor age it would have, excuse the pun, towered over all the other buildings except St. Paul's Cathedral. All knew to fear a trip to the tower, as many had passed through the centuries-old building, but few ever came out. It is seldom ever a place for bonding, although this might have just been the case for Robert and Elizabeth. Any childhood friendship they may have had surely must have been strained by the actions of Robert's father in 1553. John Dudley was, at this point, the Duke of Northumberland, and after the Protestant King Edward VI died childless, the king changed the succession to exclude both his elder half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, due to incompatibilities in religion and the question of their illegitimacies. The person Edward chose instead to inherit was Lady Jane Grey, who just so happened to be married to Lord Guilford Dudley, who was one of John Dudley's sons and Robert's younger brother. Historians have debated back and forth whether Edward came to this decision on his own or whether he was egged on by Northumberland, chasing power and prestige for his family. But whatever the reason, Northumberland got to work immediately to place Jane Grey on the throne and to bar Mary, and by extension Elizabeth, from it. The coup ultimately failed because Northumberland underestimated just how quickly Mary could mobilize and how popular she would be. And, crucially, the Privy Council turned on Northumberland at the last minute and declared for Mary instead. So at this point, Northumberland was doomed.
Scary prospect, isn't it, really, when you know that someone so close in your generations have ended their life in the Tower. And, of course, the same with Elizabeth as well, knowing the fate of her mother there when she was so small as well.
Yes, exactly. That, I think the Tower is something that would be very strong in Elizabeth's, even just her cultural memory, even if she had never seen it or been in it before. That is a incredibly emotive symbol for her. And one wonders if she was friends at this point with Robert, what she must have been thinking. What for somebody she feels close with is now effectively working against her, and now likely will be put to death, because at that point in time, nobody thought the Dudleys would get out of this scot-free. So.
And how old was Dudley at that time?
Robert?
Yeah.
So he's 21 years old. So again, he's only a year older than Elizabeth. So Elizabeth would have been 20. Just thinking back to myself in my early 20s, I can't even imagine dealing with something like this.
No, absolutely.
No.
So was Northumberland himself taken to the Tower?
Oh, yes, he was. In fact, all of the Dudley men were, for they had all helped their father in some way, shape, or form in the coup. The Dudleys were a remarkably close-knit and fiercely loyal to each other as far as Tudor noble families went. And as I said, Robert was a young man of 21 years old when he and his brothers were arrested in 1553. All of them were taken to the Tower of London and held in the Beauchamp Tower together. This is a tower that today stands directly to the left of the Pillow Memorial commemorating those who were executed in the tower, just so people can have a bit of a visualization of where the Beauchamp Tower is. Their father, on the other hand, was held separately from their sons. But I do believe that the Dudley sons were held together in the same cell, for lack of a better word. All the Dudleys were condemned to death, but only Northumberland was executed immediately after the coup and Mary's accession. His execution was postponed just long enough for him to take Catholic communion and renounce his Protestant faith. Whether this was a genuine change of heart or the actions of a desperate man trying to assuage his monarch and save his sons, we'll never really know for sure. But Guildford and Jane continued to be held in the Tower, and at first, Mary was of a mind to pardon them. But all of that changed once Elizabeth comes into the picture again. In only a matter of months, Mary is dealing with a major rebellion, and that is Wyatt's Rebellion. This rebellion aimed to depose the Catholic Mary Elizabeth to Edward Courtenay, who was now another prisoner in the Tower, and put her on the throne instead. This rebellion failed as well, and though there was no definitive proof of her involvement beyond some potentially suspicious correspondence, Elizabeth was nevertheless implicated, and so she too was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The Dudleys at this point had been there for about half a year. Wyatt's rebellion, unfortunately, spelled doom for Guildford and Lady Jane. Jane's own father foolishly participated in the rebellion after he was already pardoned once by the Queen, and it was becoming too dangerous to have multiple figures of opposition alive, no matter how young they were. So both Guildford and Jane were put to the axe as soon before Elizabeth arrived at the Tower. And one can only imagine how terrified Elizabeth must have been, and her anxiety shows when she later asks if Jane's scaffold had been taken down or not. While she was imprisoned, Elizabeth endured intense interrogation, but she held her own, and no hard proof could be found to implicate her. The case for Elizabeth grew even stronger when Thomas Wyatt, who was the leader of Wyatt's rebellion, cleared her of all knowledge or responsibility of the rebellion upon the scaffold before his own execution. After a while, the security around Elizabeth's imprisonment was slightly loosened, and she was allowed to walk the gardens of the Tower.
It sounds so harrowing, doesn't it? I mean, for her to be arrested, taken on boat, and then go through Traitor's Gate into the Tower of London at such a young age, knowing that your mother went into the Tower of London and never came out.
Yes, that must have been the mirroring of Elizabeth's entrance into the Tower with her mother. It's one of those things that you would think it is a bit cliche if it didn't actually happen in real life. It's one of those things that if you saw it in a movie, you'd think, oh, that's a bit on the nose. But no, it actually really did happen. In terms of Elizabeth arriving by Traitor's Gate, I think recent research has actually said that she arrived by Tower Wharf, so not through the gate itself, but rather docked alongside the tower and then went through essentially the main entrance. I think in John Fox's Annals, he mentions Traitor's Gate, but as I'll mention a bit further, Fox's Annals tends to be a kind of mix of history and propaganda. So he kind of put in what every detail would make it a little more evocative. But regardless, either way, they both ended up in the same incredibly unenviable situation.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I've got two things there. A, if she's asking whether Jane's scaffolding has been taken down, it means she didn't have a view of it. And the other thing I've got in my mind is that Elizabeth is actually kept in the apartments where her mother had been kept.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and that is actually something I'll touch upon in just a second. But yes, in terms of Jane's scaffold, I actually can't remember if she would be able to see it or not, but certainly she would know it was there. And I believe she asked about it a bit later into her imprisonment when her anxiety was very high. And effectively, she was trying to gauge whether she was going to be executed or not. And again, that's something that I can't even imagine having that constantly in the back of my head, that you may or may not just lose your life.
No, at the hands, or at least at the request of your half-sister.
Yeah, that's oh gosh, the relationship between Mary and Elizabeth deserves an episode on its own because it is heartbreaking and frustrating and just all kinds of emotional devastation with those two.
I mean, Elizabeth has known her all her life, you know, and being, I suppose, the wrong religion at that time, but she was so clever to try and walk that tightrope to not annoy anybody too much on either side, just to save her neck. It's terrifying,
indeed.
really.
There was a lot of quite a lot of bad blood between the two sisters at that point. They had a fairly good relationship with each other when they were younger. Mary had, I suppose, for lack of a better word, a lot of trauma when it came to Elizabeth's whole existence, to be honest. So one can understand where she's coming from, but it got very messy on both sides as the years progressed.
No, agreed. And did Elizabeth and Robert meet while in the tower?
Ah, well, this is where things get interesting. Well, at least for me. Elizabeth and Robert's relationship was so close and enduring, despite occasional yet intense stormy periods, that their contemporaries were at a loss to explain why their bond was so strong their entire lives. The historian William Camden took a shot at it and said, whether this proceeded from any virtue of his, whereof he gave some shadow tokens, or from their common condition of imprisonment under Queen Mary, or from his nativity, and the hidden consent of the stars at the hour of their birth, and thereby a most straight conjecture of their minds, a man cannot easily say. So what Camden here suggests is that their mutual imprisonment alone might have fostered a connection between them, because the club of people who spend time in the tower and live to tell a tale was very small. He might have been onto something here. Over the centuries, a more romantic story has been spun, one in which Robert and Elizabeth have a clandestine meeting within the tower's imposing stone walls and where they fall in love with each other.
Oh, I blame the Victorians.
Yeah, as an aside, most Tudor myths are because of the Victorians, but that's a whole nother kettle of fish. Much as I would love for this to be true, because I am a hopeless romantic at heart, there just isn't any evidence to suggest that this ever happened, nor would it have been terribly plausible. Not to mention that at this point, the Dudleys were given leave for their wives to visit them. And Robert was still married to Amy Robsart. And in the beginning, at least, their marriage appears to have been a happy one. So, you know, when you visit the tower today, you can have the pleasure of attending one of the yeoman tours, which takes you around the grounds of the tower, while one of the yeomen of the guard tells you stories. I would highly recommend these, as they are incredibly entertaining and informative. However, I'm afraid I do have to correct them on one of their oft-repeated points that Elizabeth was held in the bell tower. She was not. The story of Elizabeth being held in the bell tower originated, as I mentioned before, in John Fox's Annals, which was, again, part history, part propaganda. Whether Fox came up with this story or not, no doubt he thought it appealed to the mythology of Elizabeth, because who can resist a real-life princess locked in the tower story?
Well, exactly.
Alas, for narrative satisfaction, Elizabeth was actually held, as you rightly said, in the royal apartments in the old palace, which were fit for a queen, but would have still been psychologically damaging for her, as her own mother was also held there before her own execution. The Tudor Travel Guide has a wonderful article about these apartments, if listeners want more info, by the way. So what does this have to do with Robert? Well, if you ever visit the tower, you'll notice that the bell tower is conveniently close to Beauchamp Tower, where Robert was held. Tradition holds that they might have met on the walkway between them, but as Elizabeth was held somewhere else entirely, this is most unlikely.
So yes, I think we got the Victorians to blame for a lot of these kind of stories, these love stories, and I don't think it's just physically possible, as you mentioned, where each of these towers are, the amount of guards that would have been in between, and even if it had been a secret meeting, I mean, that could have been a setup, and it makes them both look even more guilty, surely.
That's the thing. Yeah, it would be incredibly hard to pull something off like that. You would have to have some intense bribery going on, and something tells me that we would have eventually found out, even if they did manage to bribe the guard, which has happened. I'll touch on this later. Or rather, who knows, it was bribery. Again, I'll get to it in a second. But even if they had managed to, I can almost guarantee you we would know. something would have trickled down to the current age for us to, you know, dig our teeth into.
So did they, well, was there any way for them to communicate at all?
There might have been. Big capital M might, but let's examine this. Elizabeth was allowed to take occasional excursions out on the grounds to get some fresh air, under guard, of course. Robert might have been able to glimpse her if his windows weren't boarded up to prevent this, but they certainly couldn't have communicated this way. But there were other ways to get covert communication from one prisoner to the other in the Tower. At one point, the diplomat Simon Renard wrote to the Holy Roman Empire that the lieutenant of the Tower at the time, Sir John Bridges, was suspected of being a heretic and possibly sympathetic to Elizabeth's plight. He was suspected of appointing a certain gentleman named Poins to guard Elizabeth in order to enable him to intrigue with her. This, however, didn't stop him from doing his duty to Queen Mary, since he helped quash the White Rebellion. He didn't incur so much suspicion that Mary didn't trust him to keep Elizabeth in the Tower, but the desire to stay in Elizabeth's good books might have been there. And a later letter from Renard also says that it is proved that Courtney has sent a child of 5, the son of one of the soldiers in the Tower, to present his commendations to Elizabeth. Courtney, as previously mentioned, was a fellow prisoner and arguably of higher priority at this point than the Dudleys, whose executions seemed to be permanently delayed. If Courtney was able to send messages to Elizabeth, perhaps aided by a sympathetic guard, then it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Robert Dudley might have tried to do the same. Not to mention, stranger and more extraordinary things have happened in the Tower. During Elizabeth's reign, Catherine Grey was imprisoned for marrying Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, without permission. Catherine, who, by the way, was Lady Jane's sister, was in the succession, so this added to the severity of her transgression. Elizabeth ordered that Catherine and Edward be kept strictly apart from each other in the Tower, but their guards were clearly sympathetic because not only were they allowed to meet, they managed to conceive a child whilst in the Tower together.
Ta-da!
Yeah, so high security, huh? A Tudor prison is only as secure as its guards.
Cool.
And if the guards are able to be swayed, either with emotion or with money, much can slip by. So I personally think that some historians are a little too quick to dismiss it as a total impossibility. The precedent is there. Still, the fact remains that there is no surviving evidence to suggest that Robert and Elizabeth successfully communicated or met whilst they were in the Tower together. Nevertheless, I think Camden might have been correct when he surmised that the Tower marked a turning point in their relationship, one where they couldn't help but start to feel drawn to each other. After all, not only were they in the Tower at the same time, both experiencing that dread of wondering which day might be their last, they both also lost a parent to the axe at that same location. Elizabeth's mother and Robert's father rest together for eternity in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. That's a unique experience, even for an age as bloody and dangerous as the Tudor age. No wonder they emotionally clung to each other for so much afterwards. Ultimately, we have remarkably few sources to tell us about how Elizabeth and Robert interacted after they were both released from the Tower. There is the possibility that Robert may have financially supported her, but the hard evidence for this is scarce, aside from 2 people talking about it later in Elizabeth's reign. But also, as an aside, if you're financially helping the heir to the throne who the queen does not like, one would imagine you're probably keeping it on the down low and striking it from your household accounts. So again, not impossible, but no hard evidence. But what we do know is that by the time Elizabeth became queen in November 1558, the Count de Feria, a Spanish ambassador in England, reported that Lord Robert was known to be one of the men who Elizabeth was, quote, on very good terms with. One of her first appointments as queen was to make Robert her master of the horse, and by April 1559, people were already commenting on their intimacy. It's a long road from the Tower to the court.
Yeah. suppose it's like anything though. It's like with celebrities, you know, if you're seen with someone, then there's the gossip straight away, and especially if she's unmarried, they've got to gossip about something, haven't they? And as you said, if he is handsome, then yeah. So how did Elizabeth get her financing whilst Mary was queen? I mean, what was going on? Where was she getting it from?
Well, generally, she was given a settlement by her father, so that's where her money comes from. And also, as a noblewoman and a royalty, in fact, she is a landowner, one of the biggest landowners in England. And in fact, before Mary was queen, she was the second biggest, I believe, landowner in England after her sister. So the revenue from that land would essentially come into her own pocket. But I do remember reading, if I'm not mistaken, that she was kind of struggling with money at certain points. It was difficult for her to keep on top of her finances. So any and all support would have been quite welcome. And again, even though it doesn't show up in Robert's household accounts, and we have no paper trail for this, if he did financially support her in some way, the traditional thought is that he sold land, because that's what one of the later sources says. Then that would kind of explain why she was already on such good terms with him at the beginning of her reign.
And why she
another reason, or another reason why she felt like she could trust him. Interesting to note that the other source only mentions that he sold some possessions. So one of them says land, the other one says possessions. And by the way, these sources are just essentially ambassadors talking to people from England. So it is a little bit of hearsay, but one of them mentions that Elizabeth herself supposedly said this. So it's all kind of,
it's gossip column.
Yeah, it could be gossip, it could be true, who knows. Regardless, it was something that was known or talked about at the time. So who knows, really.
So we've mentioned the towers, and you mentioned about the yeoman's tour and the little correction that they need to add into their script. But for those who are heading to the Tower of London, I've got my HRP card, so I'm going to go back again to have a little look. But can you visit where Dudley and Elizabeth I were held as prisoners, the real rooms?
Ooh, partially. Obviously, the Tower of London is open for visitors and is one of my absolute favorite historical locations in London, so I would highly recommend it to anyone, whether you're a Londoner who has never gone around to it or a visitor to the city. It is well worth the price of the entrance ticket. You are able to enter Beauchamp Tower and climb up the very narrow, very winding staircase to see where the Dudley brothers were held. There you can even see the carvings in the stone walls where the bored young men whiled away the hours. Robert just put his initials and some oak leaves near the window facing Tower Green, but on the other side, his eldest brother John, the Earl of Warwick, created a very intricate engraving with their family emblem and different flowers and leaves to symbolize each brother. He really missed his calling as a carver, if you see it, because it's stunning.
It is, and I will try and share photos that I've taken over the years, so to share with those who can't visit at the moment.
Absolutely, would recommend. But unfortunately, you cannot visit where Elizabeth was held, as those buildings, which I believe were built by her father for her mother, are no longer extant, as far as I know. Even if you wanted to visit the Bell Tower of Legend, which also held other high-profile prisoners like Thomas More, it's currently not available to view. Still, it's wonderful to see the Dudley carvings and to imagine what Robert might have felt losing his father and his brother, and then hearing that his old friend was imprisoned in the same tower.
Yeah, totally. As I said, it's a brilliant place to explore. We've got episode 4 all about the crown jewels. Obviously, nothing from the Tudor times there, sadly, thanks to Oliver Cromwell, but it's still in the same place. And all that's left for me to say, Corina, is thank you so much. Thank you for your knowledge and also your energy. I absolutely loved it.
Oh, well, again, thank you so very much for having me on. It's been such a pleasure being here. A thrill because this is my first podcast.
Thanks for joining us this week. Until next time.